happened to so many people. We wouldn't have 3/4 of us knowing someone who's made a suicide attempt if it hasn't happened to an awful lot of people.
It just seems that there's so many depressed people nowadays. Is this something that we're just hearing about more now and has always been through history? Or is this something that's more a product of our modern living now?
I think we're just hearing about it now more. But I think it was with us throughout history, and we called it different things. We called it cranky person. We called it someone who was strange. We called depression someone who just didn't want to be around people. But there's another thing afoot, and that is there were a lot of depressed people in the world way back when, and often they married each other. And the cruel geometry of genetics has produced an awful lot of the rest of people who are depressed and who are the children of depressed people.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was genetic, and I didn't know it's passed on. So people that have had family members that are depressed and suicidal, they may become suicidal themselves.
It appears to run in families. No one has proved it, but if you talk to somebody who has the disease of depression and you ask them, did anybody else in your family appear to have depression? Did they have trouble sleeping, have trouble eating, appear to be grumpy and cranky at times in their lives? They will say, yes, this relative, that relative.
Oh, okay.
So you
there's
can
a history.
see it. There is a history often in families. So I believe that eventually they will show that some forms of depression can be passed on through families. And it does appear that suicide runs in families, probably because of the way that pain is tolerated or pain is perceived in families.
And dealt with, yeah.
And dealt with.
Or not.
But they've done MRI tests, and they've found that in some families, the brain actually reacts more to pain in a particular family than it does in another family.
Really?
Really.
Wow, that's I have a question here. Is there a national phone number? Is this just local Bay Area that deals with suicide? I mean, I'm sure throughout the United States there's other associations in each state. Is there a national number? Is there one number that people can call no matter where they are?
Yes, there is a national number, and the national number is 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-SUICIDE. There are two national numbers, and both of them do the same thing. They will connect you with one of the 500 suicide crisis centers in the U.S. that are actually modeled on San Francisco suicide prevention. We were the oldest one. We were the first one to use volunteers.
Now, San Francisco was the first? The very first?
San Francisco was the very first volunteer hotline in the United States, and it was started by a journalist.
Okay.
It was started by an anchorman for the British Broadcasting Corporation, and he came over to do a TV story about why San Francisco had such a very high suicide rate. And we did have a really high suicide rate at that time.
And this was in the 70s?
In the early 60s.
Oh, early 60s. Okay.
Early 60s.
What was the reason for the high suicide rate in the early 60s?
Nobody knows. No one was studying it then. It was probably the fact that a lot of people here had come here rootless from other places and were separated from their families, separated from their homes. But no one really knows. And so he decided to start the first hotline because in Great Britain they had hundreds of them everywhere.
And we're so behind.
We were completely behind.
Yeah.
There were none in the United States. So he trained some people, and they opened a line in the Tenderloin, and it was the first one, and rapidly they spread. Almost immediately, there were 5 in the Bay Area, and then they spread across the United States like wildfire.
Wow. And you've been doing this for 20 years. I'm flabbergasted that you have such a wonderful outlook and very bubbly and sparkly. How do you keep from letting that affect you? I can only imagine it must be so difficult to be able to disconnect from that when you leave work and not carry those thoughts or stories that you've heard with you.
Well, actually, it is not difficult. People always think this must be such depressing work, but if you think about if a child or a puppy ran into a road and you saw a car coming and you ran out really quickly and you grabbed them and you ran back with them, how wonderful you would feel that you had saved them. We feel that way all day, every day.
Yeah.
That's how it feels to do this.
Very rewarding, yeah.
It's very rewarding. And our volunteers feel that way after a shift. They come in, they work for 4 hours on the phone, and they leave looking better than when they came in. They look like an iPod ad. And
Okay.
so it really isn't as depressing as it sounds. Sometimes paying the rent gets depressing.
Oh, yeah. Been there. Definitely. A question comes to mind is just if someone calls that has terminal illness and is in a very painful state, and it's something that cannot be remedied, is there any call that you've ever taken that you think that actually it might be this person's time and that they're calling me, but this may be the right thing for them to do? Is there ever passed your mind?
Well, the decision is really up to the person, and what we feel is the person has called us because they're ambivalent. Part of them wants to go, part of them wants to stay, and we want to talk to the part of them that wants to stay here. So the person who wants to die has the right to talk. A person who is terminally ill and wants to die for that reason has the right to discuss that. Very often people won't let that person talk, even though they will let the person who is emotionally upset talk about suicide. So the terminally ill person also has the right to talk about that and is in control of his or her life too.
Ultimately, it is their decision.
Ultimately, it's their decision.
Let's talk a little bit about children and teenagers that go through hormones and craziness and depression and light and dark all in the same minute, What is the primary cause of a child that goes through depression and contemplates suicide?
I think that a couple of things operate. Young people, teenagers and children, feel pain, I think, differently from adults. Much more vividly than they do later on in their lives, and they feel it for the first time very often. The breakup of a relationship is felt for the first time then, and we used to have big extended families where you could have an uncle or an aunt who would take that person under their wing and say, yes, your heart is broken, but it will heal. And you'll be okay. It was somebody other than the parents, because nobody believes their parents. But there would be somebody who would say, you will live through this.
Yeah.
And we don't have those kinds of families anymore. So the person doesn't have that reassurance. And the pain is much more vivid. So they're very vulnerable, and unfortunately we don't have a very safe society. People have guns in their homes. We have unsafe places in our communities, like the Golden Gate Bridge, for instance. And so there is the possibility that something impulsive can happen.
Well, I've learned a tremendous amount. Eve, thank you. If you could give us the number in the Bay Area and San Francisco one more time real quick for our audience.
All right, that number is 781-0500.
And again, please, we ask you, if you are contemplating this or know someone who is contemplating this, speak to them. Speak to them honestly and openly, and don't judge, just listen, and please direct them to the line so you have professionals waiting to help. This is Christina Marie Flores. Thank you, Eve Meyer. Thank you for joining us on SF Live. Good night.